Hello, class, and welcome to our presentation, The Problem of Evil, Challenging the Existence of God. So in this lecture, we will do a general overview for context, we'll talk about the problem of evil, and then we'll discuss the four theological defenses of the Judeo-Christian God, that is, the four refutations or attempted refutations of the problem of evil. So in the previous unit, we studied several proofs for God's existence. But in this presentation, we will be studying a famous proof against God's existence, the problem of evil. And the problem of evil questions the existence of God by asking the question, why would an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God allow for evil to exist in the world? In other words, if God were all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good, you would think that God would prevent evil from existing in the world. But because evil does exist, then it puts God's existence into question. So put simply, if such a God exists, then surely evil would not exist in the world. It just makes logical sense. But because there is suffering in the world, it must necessarily follow that God does not exist. Now, the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus was among the first to raise the problem of evil in the West. And his argument is known as Epicurus' paradox, for in the argument he basically states that the existence of evil and the existence of God are a contradiction. If one exists, then the other logically cannot exist. So let's take a look at his argument. So here we have Epicurus' paradox in premise-conclusion format, and this is how it goes. God is all-powerful and all-knowing. God is perfectly good. Such a God would never allow for evil to exist. But because evil does exist, therefore God does not exist. All right, let's just let that sink in for a moment. All right, let's continue. So here's the thing, admittedly, Epicurus' paradox is quite convincing. I mean, it's rather difficult to refute. Hence, atheist philosophers like the Scottish skeptic David Hume revitalized this paradox in the 18th century in his dialogue on natural religion to argue against the existence of the Judeo-Christian God. So whereas Epicurus is a pre-Christian philosopher who's talking about or questioning the existence of a all-good God, David Hume kind of revitalized the argument to criticize the Judeo-Christian God. And so difficult is Epicurus' paradox to refute that philosophers and theologians still grapple with this problem today. Nevertheless, several philosophers and theologians have attempted to refute Epicurus' paradox by offering four major theological defenses of the existence of the Judeo-Christian God. So let's review each of them. So the first defense we're going to call evil as illusion defense, which is argued by St. Augustine, who of course we studied prior in the course. And according to St. Augustine, evil does not really exist. It is an illusion. So how does this serve as a refutation of Epicurus' paradox? Well, if we take a look at the paradox itself, we will notice the following. Epicurus, and his proponents for that matter, argue that evil exists. But St. Augustine is questioning this premise and saying, does evil exist? That is, for St. Augustine, because we witness events of suffering, we assume that evil is a thing, an object that exists in the world like an apple or a dog. But Augustine argues that there is no proof that an actual thing called evil exists in the world. That is, what we witness in the world as evil are just acts and events that lack goodness. And therefore, Augustine is famous for saying that evil is a privation of goodness. Okay, well, what does this mean, and is it valid? So for example, I'm sure most of us have had bland food before, right? So bland food isn't actually bland, one could argue. It just lacks flavor. That is, there's no actual thing in the world called bland. It just refers to the absence of something, in this case, the lack of like salt or spices, etc. So blandness isn't actually a thing. It doesn't actually exist. It just refers to the absence of something. And so St. Augustine is using the same logic. He's saying evil doesn't actually exist as a thing. It just kind of refers to the absence of goodness. So in conclusion, Augustine argues that evil is a no thing, an illusory thing that really has no existence. Hence, God exists because evil does not exist. And that's kind of his refutation of this paradox. Do you buy it? Well, give it some thought. The second defense that we are going to talk about, we're going to refer to as the Mill defense because it's argued by philosopher John Stuart Mill. And for John Stuart Mill, God allows for evil to exist because God is neither all-knowing nor all-powerful. So this is his attempted refutation of Epicurus' paradox. So how is this relevant? Well, if we take a look again at Epicurus' paradox in premise-conclusion format, we'll notice the following. Epicurus and his proponents argue that God is all-powerful and all-knowing. But John Stuart Mill asked the question, is God all-powerful and all-knowing? That is, Mill argues that there is a God that exists. So he is a theist, he does believe that God exists, but not in the way that the Western theological tradition teaches. That is, the Western theological tradition teaches that God is perfect, God is all-powerful, all-knowing. But for Mill, God is neither all-powerful nor all-knowing. So for Mill, the only way to reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of God is by arguing that God is not all-powerful and all-knowing. Thus, God allows for evil to exist in the world because God cannot prevent all evil from occurring. That is, for Mill, God is very powerful, but God is not all-powerful. So God can prevent a lot of evil from occurring in the world, but not all of it. Hence, for Mill, God can exist and evil can exist simultaneously, so there is no paradox after all. Now, for some what we might call orthodox theologians, John Stuart Mill takes his argument kind of a step too far by, saying that God is not all-powerful and all-knowing. So in our next two defenses, starting with the theodicy defense, we're going to find that people like John Hick are going to argue that no, God really is all-powerful, but there's other reasons why God doesn't allow for evil to exist in the world. And this brings us to the theodicy defense. So according to theologian John Hick, God allows for evil to exist for the purpose of soul-making. In other words, God allows for suffering in the world so that humanity can learn from their mistakes and grow from their experiences. So how is this related to or a refutation of Epicurus' paradox? Well, once again, let's take a look at the paradox itself. So according to Epicurus and his proponents, such a God, that is such an all-powerful, all-knowing God, would never allow for evil to exist in the world. That just seems logical. But he questions this and says, no, maybe it is possible that God would allow for evil to exist in the world. But if God would allow for evil to exist, then why? What's the purpose? So once again, for Hick, just as a loving parent must sometimes allow for a child to make mistakes so they can grow and mature into adulthood, so too does God allow for humanity to make errors so that they may grow spiritually. So why does God allow for evil to exist in the world? To permit human beings to, grow spiritually by learning from their errors and mistakes. So there's an actual reason for it. And this brings us to our final defense, the free will defense, which has been argued by many, many philosophers and theologians over the past couple of thousand years. But we're going to stick to the kind of modern argument by Alvin Plantinga. And for Plantinga, God allows for evil to exist so that human beings can exercise free will. So once again, how is this relevant to Epicurus' paradox? Well, as we remember from the theodicy defense, Epicurus and his proponents say that such a all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God would never allow for evil to exist in the world. But Plantinga questions this and says, well, actually, maybe God would allow for evil to exist, but why? So for Plantinga, God allows for evil to exist in the world so that human beings can have free will. That is, for him, free will is a gift from God that allows humans to choose their destiny. And if God had a choice between creating a world of perfect peace and a world of free will, God would choose the latter. But why would God do this? Because God knows that human beings enjoy free will, even if it sometimes gets them into trouble. So free will can sometimes cause evil, but God nevertheless grants it to humanity as a gift. Now, the free will defense is probably the most popular defense of the Judeo-Christian God against the problem of evil. But we have to ask ourselves a big, big question. Do human beings truly have free will? I mean, we kind of assume that we have it, I would argue, but do we really have it? Well, in the next few presentations, we are going to talk about the problem of free will in which we will evaluate this very question.